Hey, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be starting to write some JavaScript code.
This video is brought to you by Appy's Academy.
And this is where we need to open up the editor. I'm going to be using brackets, and brackets does have this feature that's called live preview. And when live preview opens up, it opens up the browser window using the HTTP protocol. So we're going to be looking at this a little bit more later on. And of course, you can run HTML, CSS, and JavaScript directly within the browser, as it takes the browser to render that out. But when we do make a connection to another web page, then we are going to need to use the HTTP protocol. So again, more on that in the upcoming lessons. So for now, make sure that you've got your code that you're writing and also a way to open it within the browser, and we can start writing some code. So first of all, let's set up a blank div. I'm going to give it a class of message. And this is how I'm going to access it using the JavaScript code. And we're going to be just doing the code, the JavaScript, right within the HTML, not linking out to a separate JavaScript file, because there's only going to be a little bit of JavaScript code that we're going to be writing. So let's make their connection using the DOM, setting up a variable object using message equals document, and then query selector in order to select the message, the element with the class of message. So dot message. So that's going to allow us to select that element. And we're also going to be able to update the inner text, the text content of the element. So I'm going to just put it to say hello. And we're going to be making use of this element updating content within the element as we move through the upcoming lessons. So next, let's create our first object. This is going to be a JavaScript object, but we're going to also structure it in a way that it's going to be also a JSON object. So creating an object, and in order to create an object in JavaScript, we create a variable name, and then we're going to assign a value to it. Assigning a value with the curly brackets means that this is going to be an object. Objects in JavaScript, just as in JSON, are name paired values. So that means that we have a name on the left-hand side and a value that's going to be on the right-hand side. And then this name is going to be always associated with this value. And they're separated by a colon and wrapped with the curly brackets in order to indicate that this is a JavaScript object. We can log the newly created object out into the console. And when we refresh the page, we have our object being represented within the console. So we can open that up and we can see that name and the value. So whenever we want to return back the value, we specify the object and then we specify the name, and that will return back the associated value. And you can also add in multiple items within here, usually that they share some type of connection. So if it's maybe the person's last name, and then the value for the last name, so whatever the value for the last name is, and we refresh. So now we've got the two items with the same structure, so name, value, last, and the value that's associated with that last name. And also important to note that when it outputs in the browser, it loses some of the JSON structure, so it's no longer doing the double quotes around it. But let's take this JavaScript object and we're going to copy it into the lint. So just clear that and validate as JSON. And we see that in fact it is indeed valid JSON because we do have the double quotes. And that's one of the important differences between the JavaScript object and JSON, is that with the JavaScript object, you don't need the double quotes. You can also use single quotes, and that's a valid way of creating the name. But whereas with JSON, we always need to have the double quotes. The values that we're associating within the object, they can be various data types. So we can have objects that are strings, numbers, objects, arrays as well within that object, objects within objects, Boolean values, and nulls. And this is a string value because we do have the double quotes around it. In order to output the content that's associated within the object with JavaScript, we would reference it. So wherever we want to put it, and I'm going to output it into the text content area of the element. So we need to reference the object and then the name of the value that we want to return back. So now when I refresh it, it's going to have value because the value is being returned back from the object, and it's updating the element value that's within that element. You can also return it back with the bracket notation. So that's another alternative option where you could do the square brackets, which typically you might be familiar with arrays, that this is one way to return back an array value using the index. But whereas here we would associate the name of that item in order to return that back, and that's going to return back that same value. So this could as well be last, and we can return back the last name that's contained within the my object. If you want to update or if you want to add to the object with JavaScript, you would type out the object and associate a value to it. And within the bracket notation, you can also have a space within the object name within the bracket notation. And then if we list out the my object after we've updated it, we're going to see that this in fact is valid, and we're outputting the first name as the name and then the value that's associated with it. So whereas this will work within the bracket notation, this won't work within the dot notation. So if you try to do the first and space name, you're going to throw an error because this isn't a valid structure. So you're not allowed to keep spaces within the dot notation, and this would be valid, but with the space it wouldn't be valid. And then when we list out the object, you can see the contents of the object that we're able to set values and associate it within that object and return it back. So before the next lesson, try this out. Open up your editor, create an object using the curly brackets, associate a name with the value, separated with the colon. Also make sure that you do use the double quotes because we wanted to practice proper JSON formatting. Output that content that you've created, call back to it and output it into your console or into your element. And also try the various ways of accessing the object by the name, either with the bracket notation or the dot notation, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.